and a couple chambers looking in, so we want to get going for them to be able to jump in today. So today we're talking HR, which if you have employees, you know is always a challenge. So we have Ann Berry back with us. Ann has presented a couple times for us. We're really excited to have them back with us. The company has recently changed their name, so you remember Ariane from our previous presentations. They are now Oasis, which is a paycheck company, so we're excited to have you and your new logo breaking out today for us. Ann possesses more than 10 years of HR leadership experience. She currently leads HR professionals who work in the organization to align with their HR strategy. She's focused on creating innovative ways to engage employees and help organizations establish a culture that leads a high performance and success. So I will turn it over to Ann and we'll get going right away.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? In the back? Good. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to talk about this topic. I know sometimes it's tough to see a topic called HR mistakes and have somebody to talk about it, and if that's something you want to hear about. But I hope that what you get from this are just some different ideas for how to avoid some of these pitfalls. So I lead a HR team of really HR consultants that work with small businesses to help them with their HR strategy, help with HR compliance. And so what we've done today is really take some thematic areas within HR that come up on a regular basis and try to talk through what those are, and also hopefully some ideas around how to prevent some of those pitfalls. So again, thanks for having me. First thing is a disclaimer. So I am not an attorney, and this is not to be construed with legal advice. So of course, at any time, you should always reach out to an attorney if you need legal advice. So the agenda today, there are top 5 really challenges that businesses, small businesses and large businesses face. And we're going to kind of tick through these, go through them one by one. So the first one is this idea that the law doesn't apply to me. So we do run across this at times where small businesses, there's a thought that maybe, oh, these regulations don't apply because I don't have that many employees. So we're going to kind of talk through that and what that looks like. Another area is classification. What I mean by this is related to the Fair Labor Standards Act, so FLSA, and there's 2 components that we're going to talk about today. One is classifying employees correctly as it relates to exempt or non-exempt status, so paying employees that are eligible for overtime or not, and also independent contractors versus employees. We're also going to talk a little bit about outdated sexual harassment prevention. This is really a big theme right now, particularly within HR in light of the Me Too movement. So what we're seeing is a transformation really of how we've addressed and prevented and addressed sexual harassment in the workplace. In addition, and I hope you didn't think that maybe that this presentation would exclude a conversation about documentation. That's always, I think, one of the #1 things that when you call your HR person and you've got a difficult employee situation that you need to address, usually one of the first things that HR is going to ask you about is, can you please show me your documentation? So I'm going to take a little bit of a different spin on that and talk through that from a coaching and leadership perspective. And then also want to talk about outdated engagement strategies. So right now, we all likely, at some form or fashion, our businesses are experiencing the hit as it relates to the low unemployment rates, which means that has an impact on being able to retain and find talent. So some ideas around some new and different ideas related to engagement in this type of era with such low unemployment. So I do also break a few rules. I know that the guidance on putting together a proper PowerPoint presentation is to keep very minimal words. I sometimes break that rule. I hope that's okay today. But what I've got here are a list, and you can see along the left-hand side the number of employees. That if your organization has this many employees, that's whether or not the regulation would apply to you. So as you can see, 1 is along the left side. I have another slide too, and the number just goes up depending on the regulation. So these are federal regs, so these don't include the Iowa state regs. That'll be on another slide here coming up. So a couple just highlights here. We've got the ECPA, ERISA, which is regulates benefits through profit sharing or 401k. Equal Pay Act is another one, and this one is this one. There's lots of conversations about this. Now would be a good time to do an equal pay review within your organization if you haven't done that for a while. There's a lot of focus on that in the regulatory environment. Also, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, and that regulation regulates the payment of minimum wage as well as the exempt, non-exempt, and independent contractor versus employee, which we'll talk about today as well. USERRA, which provides protections for employees who serve in the military. The Immigration Reform and Control Act, so making sure that your employees are authorized to work in the U.S. and processes related to I-9 verifications. The NLRA, and this is one that we, sometimes I think people think, well, this doesn't apply to me because I'm not covered under a collective bargaining agreement. And the NLRA actually does have some things that are stated that do apply to all organizations, so it's good to know about. OSHA is another regulation that applies to all organizations. The next page, and again, keep in mind these are federal, so the next slide is going to say that Iowa has some different numbers here, but Pregnancy Discrimination Act, 15 or more employees. GINA, which protects genetic information. Americans with Disabilities Act. So with this one, the Iowa Civil Rights Act is it protects those employees that work in an organization have 4 or more employees. So while this says 15, that's federal, but if your state provides broader protections for employees, then that would supersede the federal. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, again, there's the Iowa Civil Rights Act that has it protects employees if you have 4 or more employees. Age discrimination, COBRA, FMLA, so that's if you have 50 or more employees. The ACA, and WARN, which is the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. But again, as I mentioned, so the next slide, this slide shows that in Iowa, the Iowa Civil Rights Act protects employers that have 4 or more employees from discrimination. And Title VII of the Iowa Civil Rights Act also has some additional protections for other protected classes. In addition, in Iowa, there's a requirement to provide all Iowa to grant up to 8 weeks of leave for pregnancy or related medical conditions. And then, as I mentioned on WARN, so there's a term used, you hear about it, the state regs for WARN Act, so there's a lot of different ones in different states. And in Iowa, it requires employers with 25 or more, whereas the federal was 100. So, all that being said, my role here was not to necessarily give you all of the details of every single one of these. The idea is more, these regulations do apply to small businesses, and so it's good for you and your organization to have understanding of what that means for your organization and how it impacts you and your teams. All right, so number 2, we're going to actually deep dive into one of those, into the Fair Labor Standards Act, so FLSA. And so one of the things that we see a lot that comes up, and really it comes up a lot because it can be very confusing, is related to classifying employees correctly. And what I mean by that is there's 2 components I'm going to talk about. One is if you're classified correctly as exempt or non-exempt, which means whether or not that employee should be eligible to receive overtime or not. The other component is whether or not an employee should be considered an employee of the organization or an independent contractor. And both of these have very specific requirements around them and what that means and whether or not the individual falls in each category. So one of the common misconceptions that we hear a lot is that the classification as to whether or not that person should be eligible for overtime is based on their job title. And that's a misconception in that it's actually based on the job duties and functions of the role. So if you could have a chief manager of all of the things as a job title, doesn't necessarily mean that they would be considered exempt under FLSA. So it depends on what their functions are on a day-to-day basis. There are a number of different, there's some really good fact sheets on the Department of Labor website which show really what those different classifications are. So there's exemption categories under executive, administrative, professional, computer, and outside sales, and there's some really good tools out there to look at. One of the things that I think, the one that comes up probably the most that we work with is the administrative exemption. And within that, one of the components that you have to review to determine if an individual should be considered exempt or non-exempt is whether or not they exercise independent judgment as part of their job. That can be very gray and subjective. So imagine if we had an individual in a role that we were talking about collectively here as a group, and we all went around to decide if they exercise independent judgment, we all might have some different answers to that. So that's where it gets tricky, and that's where a lot of times organizations can get tripped up by that. So again, it's not based on job title, it's based on the duties within that, and then within that, they're the different exemptions that you look at to determine if somebody can be classified as exempt or non-exempt. There's another component too, which is the minimum salary requirement. So under the current regulations, an employee who makes less than $455 per week would need to be eligible for overtime. One thing to note is that that is likely, and that's roughly, I think, 24,000 or so. That's likely going to change. There's currently review to move that minimum threshold up to 35,000. 2 years ago, there was the potential to move it up to actually 47,000. So there's a lot going on with this, and it's good to be watching for that, because if you have employees that make underneath that threshold, then they would automatically need to be eligible for overtime. The other thing that's really considered is the type of work too, and the employee's primary duties associated with it, as I mentioned before. A couple things that we hear a lot as it relates to exempt or non-exempt or the independent contractor conversation is, well, this is our industry. This is how our industry handles it. And that doesn't always mean that it's the right way. There's been cases that a whole industry was classifying groups, individual roles incorrectly. So that may not be, that's not a justification or a defense to the classification. Also, another thing we hear is, well, that's the way they've been set up for years. Well, again, that also doesn't mean that that's the way it should be going forward. So it's really a good time to always look at that and specifically look at what those duties are. And it impacts small businesses particularly because a lot of times we have individuals that play lots of different roles. You know, they're doing lots of different things. So having some kind of regular review of exemption status is crucial. Another component that I want to talk about related to FLSA is whether or not an individual can be considered an employee or an independent contractor. So what I've popped up here on the presentation slide, the behavioral, financial, and type of relationship is related to the IRS rules. There's also rules that are listed under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So broadly, behavioral, does the company control? Control is a big part of this as far as whether or not somebody should be considered an employee or an independent contractor, depending on how much control the organization has in working with that individual. Financial, are there business aspects of the job controlled by the payer, meaning the employer? Meaning what do we provide the tools that the individual uses, the building, the facility, and whether or not we provide reimbursement for various expenses. The type of relationship, is there a contract that defines what that relationship is? And will the relationship continue on an ongoing basis, or is it just for a set period of time? And also, is the function of that position the same as the primary business function that your organization does? So lots of information there, but at the highest level, what you want to think about is whether or not the person is legitimately in business for themselves. Is that independent contractor legitimately in business for themselves? Do they work for other organizations, meaning they run their own business, they provide this service to you, but they also provide it to 10, 15 other different groups? Do they try to get new sales? Do they try to promote their business? So those are the types of things that's going to lend them more towards being an independent contractor. The reason why this is important is because as an employee, employees get protections that you wouldn't otherwise as an independent contractor. So employees may be eligible for severance pay if they were to exit the organization. They are eligible for benefits. Taxes are withheld. Eligible for overtime, as I just mentioned, potentially. So there are a lot of things that employees may get as far as those benefits that independent contractors would. And if the independent contractor is misclassified, then you have quite a bit of risk and liability in those particular situation. So when you usually hear about this, when people talk about, well, what an example, you probably always hear what us HR people like to talk about, the plumber example. So an example being, I work at an HR consulting company, and our toilets stop working. I'm going to go out and hire a plumber to come in and fix those toilets. So I don't tell them how to fix the toilet. I also don't give them the tools. I wouldn't even know what you would do to begin to fix that toilet. Plumbing's not the primary business of the organization. It's not HR consulting. It's also short-term. Hopefully it's short-term. I don't control how I pay them for their services. Likely at some point in time, they said, this is my fee, and then we pay it. And they likely work for other clients. So in that example, that plumber would be likely a true independent contractor. But where it gets sticky is when, in other situations, which I'm gonna go through. And so let's say you're also an HR consulting company, and you decide that you're gonna hire a group of independent contractors that are HR consultants for your organization. And this is when you're gonna start to run into more issues. So one, that's the primary focus of the business. HR consulting, I'm hiring independent contractors that are also doing HR consulting. Likely, I'm gonna have some parameters for how I want those HR consultants to do their job. I'm not probably gonna want them necessarily giving certain advice over here that's really not within ingrained in what the philosophy is of the organization. May or may not be short-term, so that's something to consider. And a lot of times, the question would be is, do they work for their clients? And sometimes we don't necessarily want our HR consultants working with all of our competitors. Do I give them computer? Do I give them a facility? So those are the things that, again, is likely gonna show that individual's probably more of an employee than an independent contractor. So those are kind of the two things, and it's really important to look back and going back to this idea of, are they legitimately running their own business? So if you do have independent contractors within your organization, it's not a bad time to do a review and think about whether or not they do meet those qualifications. Okay, so I want to kind of go back real quick to the exempt, non-exempt portion. And this is an exercise not to talk about how to classify somebody as exempt or non-exempt or determine whether or not they should be exempt or non-exempt, but rather the liability that organizations can have in these types of situations. So Bill is an assistant manager. Through that job title, a lot of times you might think that perhaps they could be considered exempt under FLSA, but again, it goes back to those job functions and job duties. Bill makes $40,000 per year and works approximately 50 hours per week. And as I mentioned, we're gonna just go ahead and assume that Bill does not meet the qualifications to be exempt, and so he should be eligible for overtime payment. So by misclassifying that individual, the liability for Bill's unpaid overtime would be approximately $15,000. So again, that's going back on the unpaid overtime. You go back 2 years if it's not willful. If it's willful, you would go back 3 years. So if you intentionally knew that this person was misclassified. You double the amount for liquidated damages. So a couple things. If you misclassify somebody, unpaid overtime payable for 2 years or 3 years, back payroll taxes also, which is not included in that $60,000 number, liquidated damages, fines, also that number doesn't include attorney's fees and litigation costs. So the other component to know is that $60,000 is for one person. So usually what happens is the Department of Labor doesn't just look at that one person. They're gonna look at everybody in that class or in that group of employees or the entire organization. So again, the misclassification can have a pretty big ramification of an expense to your organization. The other thing too about this example is we said that Bill works 50 hours a week, but in these situations, you don't always know whether or not you wouldn't know whether or not they worked 40, 50, 60, et cetera. And so if Bill can produce emails that show that he was working off and on lots of different hours, then that number could be different, but you don't have a tracking for it. So again, making sure employees are classified correctly, and in some cases, more conservatively than maybe you have to, just because there's always a lot of different litigation and claims cases around this. Yes?
So occasionally we have a client who has 1099 contract employees. They use a time clock, time and attendance system, and they want to be able to track those 1099 employee hours in the time system. Now, it doesn't get reported to us and process payroll, but that's how they track their hours. Would that put them in a bad spot to look more like the employer, or?
It would be a component of it, yes. So again, the more that they're using tools, the more that you're controlling the work, the more that you're dictating those types of things, then the more they could be considered an employee. So there's a whole, all of those things as far as control, do they work for other organizations, is there a contractor agreement, all of those components go into it, and the more they start and look and feel like an employee, the more that they likely probably are. So one of the big things too is, if you have Oh, yes. Okay. The question was, if I can remember exactly, but the question was a group that has their independent contractors clocking in and clocking out to be able to see how much time they're working. The question was whether or not that would allow that person to look more like an employee than an independent contractor. And the answer was likely, meaning all of these different components would likely add up to somebody looking more like an employee than an independent contractor, because you're keeping track of their time, and there's likely some control over that for some business reason. So if you go back to that plumbing example, likely you wouldn't have your plumber clock in and clock out for the time they're at your place of business to fix. So it's a multi-prong approach. Good question, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna move on. So that was a lot. I mean, FLSA, I think honestly you could spend a whole day talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act as well as the upcoming changes with it. But the big takeaway here is really to look at and review the exempt, non-exempt classifications within your organization, as well as independent contractor versus employee. Okay, so another heavy topic here. We've got outdated sexual harassment prevention. And this is something that's actually been trending quite a bit within the HR space, particularly because of the Me Too movement. So what the Me Too movement did, and I'll kind of go through it, is really required us to really look at sexual harassment prevention and how to address it differently than we maybe had before. So Title VII is the reg that protects employees from harassment in the workplace. So kind of going back a little bit, tell a personal story. My background has been in HR my entire career. And so I started out going out, I would travel across the US and I would provide sexual harassment training with managers, with employees. And I really felt very proud of the work I was doing, and that I would, pop up the videos that would show something, and then I'd pause it and say, is this or isn't this? And we'd have a nice dialogue about it. And likely in a lot of cases, which I know from the distance it may be hard to see, but I would potentially pop up the chart up here, which for those that can't see, it's taken from the EEOC website, and it shows the number of claims that have been received. And if you can see it, what it shows is that claims just continually went down. And so I would probably show this and say, we're making progress and things are changing. But what's happened actually in the last few years, if you notice, well, you may not, because you might not be able to see it, but in 2017 to 2018, so that's the last two columns, there was a big spike in the number of claims reported. So at the same time, there was also a lot going on as it relates to sexual harassment claims in the media. So Me Too, it was a movement against sexual harassment and sexual assault. It was started by a woman named Tarana Burke in 2006, but it really gained momentum in 2017 and 2018. So we all kind of likely heard the names Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, Mario Batali, Matt Lauer, et cetera. And so, and I don't pretend to think that our businesses and the businesses that we work in are the same as the entertainment industry. But what's important about this is it gave us an opportunity to really look at, well, what were we doing wrong, or what could we improve upon as it relates to sexual harassment prevention in the workplace? Me Too allowed people to feel more comfortable to report. So again, it gave a platform for people to say, this happened to me, and make people feel more comfortable to report those types of claims. So we're seeing more claims, which is ultimately a good thing, but it begs the question really of what can we do differently? And that's where a lot of HR folks have been looking at this and identifying different ways to address and tackle sexual harassment in the workplace. So first, let's start with why don't people report? So there's a number of different reasons. One of the first and primary is the fear of retaliation. So people fear that if they report something that they may lose their job or that they may be retaliated against. It's also an uncomfortable place for somebody to be to make a report of this nature. Also, a lot of times what we hear is that people don't feel like that specific example qualified as harassment. So they maybe didn't like the behavior, they didn't like what was happening, but they didn't necessarily know that it was harassment, so they just decided not to say anything. There's also a few other concepts that I think are really interesting to talk about in light of this, in light of some of the additional claims that have been reported, and why maybe it would insinuate that there were claims that were happening or things that were happening that weren't being reported previously. But one is called the bystander effect. And so this is based on studies that people are less likely to help a victim when others are present. So means, and some components of that are we assume that others will intervene. So you're in a group of people and you assume that somebody else would respond. A lot of times then you think, well, if nobody else is responding, then maybe I'm misunderstanding what's going on. So that's another component of the bystander effect. Another piece of it is that it becomes normalized. So the interesting thing is that the Harvey Weinstein's behavior was so known in the industry that it was actually written into lines on 30 Rock and joked at the 2013 Oscars. So it becomes normalized within the organization or the industry. Another component to why people maybe don't report is what's called effective forecasting error. And this is really the disparity between how one believes they would react in a stressful situation compared to their actual response. So there was another study that was done whereby 200 women were asked how they would respond to certain discriminatory questions in an interview process. And almost all of them said they would confront the interviewer and tell them that's not okay. In the next phase of this study, the same individuals were under the pretense that they were in real job interviews and were asked the discriminatory questions and none reported it. So, and I think we can all, it's good to think through that as far as, we say, I would absolutely report it, of course I would, but then when it actually comes down to it, the studies show that people are less likely to do that. So there's an article by Fisher & Phillips, which is a law firm, basically stated simply, you should remove, this is a quote, you should remove the following question and response from your corporate lexicon. If it was so bad, why did she wait so long to report it? If I had been in her shoes, I would have waited. I would have told the harasser to stop and then marched straight to HR. So, this is something that I think has transitioned a little bit in HR too, because likely from an investigative perspective, HR people would question that. Well, why did it take so long to report it? And it's really important to realize that there's lots of different dynamics at play for people and why and when they report. So, what can we do? Obviously, we're not here to talk about all the things that are going on, but what can we do to help? So really creating a culture that prohibits harassment and discrimination. That's a big term, that's a lot, a big statement, but how do you do that? So one of the things is, as leaders of an organization, is publicly communicate your intolerance. So if your sexual harassment prevention practices is always sat within your HR function, maybe it's time for the leaders of the organization to also speak about their intolerance of harassment and discrimination. Open door culture, which I always kind of laugh a little bit because I always think, wow, I've not worked at a closed door culture yet, but I'm sure that they could exist. But I think the idea around this is that people feel comfortable to come and talk to people within the organization. They come into your office, they have something they want to share, and you allow them to talk through that with you so you can learn and you can help enhance the culture at your organization. Apply rules consistently to both men and women and all employees, including the C-suite. Including the C-suite portion is it's hard, it's not easy, and we've worked with a lot of our clients on this. We've had some that partners or other high performers, and it's hard to make those difficult decisions. And so, but not doing that sets a stage and sends a message to your entire staff about what's tolerated at your organization. So like I said, make difficult decisions. And the other thing too is, as business leaders, is say something. So when we talked about the bystander effect, if you're in a room of people and everybody's like, nobody, and something happens and nobody says anything, well, the person that actually really should be saying something is the business leaders and owners of the organization. So that's all, each of us and all of you to say something so that people know that that behavior is not tolerated. So provide clear reporting practices. So a lot of times you probably saw in HR policies that if you, in your harassment policy, if you're not comfortable to go to your manager, you can go to HR. Well, now there's ideas and thoughts around, well, what about other people? You know, really open this up to other people so that people feel comfortable to talk to somebody about what's going on in the organization. Of course, wanting to make sure that those people that they could report it to are trained and know how to respond to those types of complaints. And then another thing that I heard once in an organization was this idea of, if you feel like you have a pocket of bad behavior that's occurring, you know, leaders of the organization going and sitting amongst that team to really understand and address it on a spot. So that's another thing that we're seeing differently. And I think I slid over it a little bit, but providing meaningful training. So on-site, mandatory, ongoing, sometimes provided by a third party. So somebody who is trained in facilitating this type of training can be much more impactful than clipping on the video like I used to do in early on in my career. So just really trying to think about the way you address, way you talk about harassment in the workplace and prevent it ongoing is important. And it's certainly important, we all know it's important, because we don't want a news article about our organization in the middle of a harassment investigation. That's one component. Obviously, there's also the distraction that it can cause our organization. Claims can be extremely distracting and difficult to navigate through while you're trying to run your business. And of course, it's not lost on the morale, engagement, recruiting, retention issues that it can cause. So one example was we had a pretty high profile, it's not local here, but situation where it was a C-suite individual that had been doing some of the harassing, and the team, the big team that reported in, just thought that's kind of what it's going to be, because this is the leader of the organization. And not addressing that can really have major impacts to your culture and retention and recruiting, et cetera. So it's really important, and it's not easy. It's not easy to address it. So it's not lost on me or anybody in HR that these can be difficult to address, but it can have a positive impact if handled correctly. Oh, all right. That was heavy. All right, so the next one here is, as I mentioned, I don't know if we can get away with having an HR presentation without talking about documentation. And so kind of want to talk through a couple things. I'm sure, like I mentioned earlier, you've maybe at various times you've had a difficult employee situation, you've reached out to your HR team member and said, what do I do? I need to move forward. This is a challenge, and your HR person likely says, can you please send me all of your documentation? This is a common theme, certainly. And some of the reasons behind that are, one, if it's not documented, it technically didn't happen. I mean, it did, but there's no proof of that. So it's important to document. Also, it helps claims to be more defensible. Another component of this too, which is not necessarily on the risk mitigation, but also employees sometimes don't think it's as big of an issue as you do if it's not documented. So they may say, oh, I was getting coaching and my manager kept telling me this, but they didn't take it that seriously until sometimes it's put in writing and documented. Certainly unemployment purposes, it's critical. And another piece is clear expectations for both manager and employee. And this is an interesting thing, because ultimately we could give coaching to an employee and address some sort of performance issue, and we could say all of the expectations that we have of that employee. They walk out of the room and we both have different versions of what actually happened and what expectations are set. As I'm sure you've probably experienced at various times, either whether or not you're the receiver of it or you've given it. People come from different places in their life, in their career, and so having a document that follows that can really add value and clarity to what's expected of that employee. Okay, so, and this is where, overall in my career, I've kind of tried to kind of understand the science behind some of it, the why don't we document, or why don't we have those critical conversations? And I think a lot of it is because to some degree it goes a little bit against our role as leaders and coaches. We're focused on helping employees improve and develop and grow, and so the idea of documenting something that somebody's doing wrong goes really contrary to that. And so that can be, difficult to kind of switch into those different modes. So we want to believe the person will improve, and sometimes we think that putting a written warning in front of them is likely contrary to helping them do that. It can deflate a person even further. And so again, if the more they're deflated, how is that going to help improve their performance? It's uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable conversation that we have to have. I had a previous leader that would joke that managers should be only paid 20% of their pay until they have to have those difficult conversations. Then they can get the rest of their pay, which of course would have some implications on the FLSA number 2 that I talked about. But it is interesting because these are uncomfortable. It's not easy to have those conversations, and so a lot of times we simply just avoid it. Also there's this topic about discipline, and I struggle with that. We're adults, and so the idea of discipline just doesn't sound like that's appropriate in the workplace. And so there's some stigma around that as far as the terms that we use. So what can we do? So one of the big things I think is, first of all, move from that term of discipline to more coaching, of course. Also identifying the root of an issue or concern. So what I've kind of listed up here are four different issues that you could come across with an employee: efficiency, responsiveness, the style, attendance. And so if you have an employee that maybe is less efficient in their job and it's really impacting their work, and you say, employee, I need you to be more efficient, and that's my expectation of you, go do it. The person likely is going to walk out and go, what do? I don't know what that means. Maybe they come from a different place. And so really it's identifying the root of the issue. So providing them with organizational tools that can help them to be more efficient, understanding their perspective on maybe why they feel they're not as efficient in their role. Responsiveness. This is the one that really can be different depending on where you come from. Some organizations, the responsiveness is immediate. Some, it's 2 days. And so people come from different places, and we don't always realize that in our coaching conversations. Could also be related to time management. So again, giving people tools related to time management. Style. So could be you have an individual that maybe overshares or communicates with clients in a certain way that's not giving us the best response. It could be emotional intelligence training or social style type training. Attendance. Attendance is something that is hard because a lot of times you need somebody to be there, and when you expect, but sometimes either a schedule change or really getting to the root of why that person continues to come in late. So really identifying the root cause and trying to give your team member tools of that sort. The other big thing is, have we eliminated our own bias? And so within our organization, we do a lot with what's called social styles. So each employee has identified, it's a 4-quadrant. There's a lot of these different tools out there. And employees are identified in one of those different quadrants, whether you're a driver, you're analytical or expressive or amiable, or the 4, but I think they have colors, they have different tools like that out there. And this can be really a helpful tool from a leadership and coaching perspective, because we start to learn more about what our own style is and how best it's going to be received by that employee. So in our world, you've got people that fall in either results focused or relationship focused. And so if I've got an employee that I've got deadlines and things that I want to understand and know where they're at with those things, and they come into my office and I start there rather than building and creating that relationship, obviously there's going to be a disconnect and some concerns from a disengagement or even like a trust perspective. So really understanding where team members are coming from, what makes them tick, that can help you from a performance management and coaching conversation. If you're not using some of those tools, they are really valuable to have within your workplace. It really shifts the dialogue and the way you talk about it. Plus, from a coaching perspective, a lot of times then you talk about it in terms of the style, not the person. So that kind of takes that the person is less defensive if you're talking about a style rather than them and what they did or didn't do. So that's critical. I think the other thing with eliminating our own bias is recognizing that there are people that come from they've been trained in a whole different organization with different thoughts, different principles, different values. And so when they come into your organization, they may not know what the new expectations are. So giving them that feedback and tools. So the question is documentation. When do you do it and how? So your HR person, myself included, are going to tell you to start early. And this doesn't mean that in that first conversation you hand out a written warning. It's really more having that dialogue and that conversation and then following up with clarifying communication to them so that this is really to benefit those employees so they know what is expected of them. The other thing, too, that goes along with that is not just about coaching on maybe what's not working, but primarily what is working. So what are the things that individual is demonstrating that aligns with your expectations and really promoting that and giving that person that feedback. It's just like we have, with children. I have a story, my daughter, she's taking tennis lessons, and actually, it was last night. We were there at the tennis courts, and she just really was not seeming very motivated at all to be playing tennis, which is what she was there to do. So I didn't, I just kind of watched her as she was going through, and then at the end, we got in the car, and I didn't say all of the things that she did wrong. I didn't start there. I didn't say you didn't run to pick up the balls, you didn't look like your friend. I didn't start there because I know that would just deflate her 100%. In fact, she might not even want to come back to play tennis ever again. So instead, we started to talk about what are the things that she did really well. Because she did. There were things that she was doing. And I also talked to her about how she was feeling and to understand really where she was coming from as far as why I found out that her leg was kind of hurting her. She was really tired after a long day. And then we kind of talked a little bit about, well, just remember, these are the things that in tennis lessons that you want to do, and I can help you with that. So it's kind of a similar conversation as we don't just dive into, me as the manager knowing what's wrong. It's more learning, seeking to understand, to have a better two-way conversation. So, like I said, as far as when we start documenting early, but definitely no later than when you see that this is not headed in the right direction. And usually at some point there's a little bit of, there's hair on the back of your neck, or there's something that demonstrates, okay, something's not tracking, and you've done the coaching. So that's the latest you should probably start the documentation process. I also will share something about documentation. I know sometimes that's, I think, confusing as to what that means. What it doesn't mean is it doesn't mean that you keep a tally of all the things that somebody does wrong. What it does mean is you have a conversation with somebody, and then you document that back to the employee to say, here's what I understood our conversation to be, just want to make sure that we are on the same page. So it's not just keeping track of it, because if you keep track of it but you never tell the employee, then they really have no opportunity to improve. So. Yes, there's different, I feel like there's different layers as it goes through the coaching process. And a lot of times what I do early on is I send a follow-up email and also ask for their feedback on how they felt they could improve. So I have some kind of documentation back and forth. Eventually, yes, you'll have a written documentation that says, here's what happened, here's what is expected of you, here's what will happen if you don't meet his expectations, and then that progresses from there. So a lot of it just depends on where you're at in that coaching. And, of course, too, the severity of the issue. We all know that sometimes little things are going on, we're giving the coaching, and something major happens. And obviously that would kind of change directions on really how we should address that performance. The other thing, too, to remember is, and I have a lot of folks in this that love feedback. They want the good, they want the bad, they want the ugly, they want all the feedback, which actually sometimes it's hard to even come up with that much feedback, but people do want that. They want it done, though, in of course, a respectful way, but they want to know how they can improve. So as managers and leaders, not to shy away from those conversations, because employees like to hear feedback. They like to know how they can improve at the organization. We all do. I know I do, so. Okay. All right, so lastly, outdated engagement strategies. And really where this came from is we have extremely low unemployment. So Iowa, as of April, was the 3rd lowest in the country. National unemployment's very low. And what this means is that if we're not doing things differently from an engagement perspective that we were doing 10 years ago, it might be a good time to really revamp and look at some of that. So why is having engaged employees important? Engaged employees are more involved in fulfilling the strategic vision of your organization. They're committed, which means they're less likely to pursue employment elsewhere. They're usually ambassadors for your organization, bringing in more business or enhancing your reputation. So Gallup has estimated that employee disengagement costs the overall U.S. economy as much as $350 billion every year. Disengaged employees, they take more sick days. They're tardy or late more often. Disengaged employees undermine the excellent work their more engaged colleagues accomplish. Constant complaining is a common characteristic of a disengaged employee. Missed deadlines, poor sales, customer complaints often arise because disengaged employees many times will create disengaged customers because a lot of times they can't help but pass on their frustrations to their clients. So it's important to have engaged employees in your workplace, and it's important to be focused on that and identify ways that you can help employees to feel more connected within your organization. So on the board here, there's a slew of different things, just kind of a lot of it's spitballing things that we've done or helped our clients with, and they may not all be something that you can or want to do. Some of them are no cost, some of them can be can cost a little bit, but the benefits can outweigh that. One basic thing is simply to show people that you care and say thank you. We've seen a lot of kind of going back in time a little bit to handwritten thank you notes and how people feel when they receive a handwritten thank you note. That's a no-cost thing that you can do within your organization. You can set the expectation that all of your managers will send handwritten thank you notes to team members as different situations arise that make that relevant. Really, that is important to help create that culture of recognition. So, and that is really doesn't cost anything. Now, you could build in other rewards, programs, and things of that nature, but to simply tell people that you appreciate the work that they do, you appreciate how it helps the business as a whole, tying it to a broader conversation is really, can be very impactful. So another component is leadership development, and I stress this because I think leadership development is so critical in organizations. What we hear a lot in HR is we always see businesses that they promoted the best widget maker. That doesn't necessarily make them the best leader or manager, and so what we have to do is we have to give those people the tools to lead and manage their teams. And so leadership development programming, and I know that there's usually an expense around it, can be very valuable for your organizations. They're the ones, we always hear the statements about people don't leave companies, they leave their manager, different things like that. And so it is the key component to engagement is that relationship between the employee and their direct manager. So really working on developing their skills. So some of the things that we've done and we talk to our clients about are things that will give better management connection. So we have all of our managers and leaders have regular one-on-ones with their employees, and we developed a one-on-one agenda. It seems very simple, but the employee comes with a completed agenda to their one-on-one meeting with their leader, and it can really transform the conversation. So some of the things in that agenda are, something that I did that made me proud. What was something that I did this week that really made me proud, or kudos from a client. Sometimes we don't even know about it because nobody's telling us. So you put that on the agenda and the employee can share that information. I actually was a little bit, when we first started rolling this out, I was a little, okay, I can do a pretty good one-on-one. I'm not sure I need an agenda to follow that. But once I started doing it, it really made those one-on-ones more, we got more accomplished, we got deeper than we ever had, and they were really very powerful. So I know it's a form, but it can really impact the connections between your managers and your employees. Another thing is related to social styles. So we have, now this goes back to what I mentioned about the different categories. So some people have colors, some people use DISC, Myers-Briggs. There's lots of different tools out there for assessments. We use what's called social styles, and we have kind of created this within our culture. So all employees go through it, and we train, we do this for our clients as well. And employees get put in these different, they take the assessment and they're into the different categories. And then we learn how to communicate with each other with that. And so it's really helpful for managers, employees, as I mentioned earlier, to, the results focus versus the relationship focus to make sure there's not butting of heads there. So that's really been a helpful tool that we've had within our organization. There's a lot of them out there. There's just a lot of them that aren't that expensive. A lot of times you maybe can find somebody within your organization that becomes the trainer on it. It doesn't have to be their full-time job. I know we're all, small business trying to get through everything, but you can identify somebody that is trained in that, and they can help train others within the organization. Another thing is team building. So, and I think there's lots of different, if you kind of do a little research on team building, there's lots of different things on this topic as far as the value of going to the escape room and doing different team building like that. And I have found that at the end of the day, the value of team building or exercises like that where you get people together is to be able to build those relationships at the bare minimum. So even if there's not training or other things that are tied to that, at least if they start to know each other on more than just a professional level, they understand that maybe somebody's got small children or they have, different ways of connecting can be very powerful. So I hold a retreat for the entire HR center every year. And like I said, the basic goal of that is for us all that we fly everybody in and everybody gets to know each other, and that's at the root of it. Now we have all these other things that we do with it to make sure our time is, but if we do nothing else, it's to build those relationships, because as your employees are connected with others within the organization, can really enhance their, whether or not they want to stay. That's a piece of it too, and their engagement as well. So, another thing too is I think asking employees what they would like to see from a team building, to getting their buy-in and their thoughts, and maybe even have them help kind of develop that, because then you're going to get their thoughts on what makes the most sense. One of the things that we did was we had employees who said, I don't need to do these team building exercises that you're having us do. I want to know how I can better work with that team. And so I want to learn more about what they do, which was great, because that's great feedback to understand really how to build the agendas for those team building events. Another concept here is stay interviews. So this is a little bit different than, exit interviews you conduct when employees leave your organization. Stay interviews, you're asking your current employees why they want to why they stay working at your organization. You can get a lot of really good data points and understanding of what makes people tick and what they like about your organization, so you can help promote and continue some of those same practices. Engagement interviews. So this is really asking more deeper questions in those one-on-ones, and you can build them as part of the one-on-one agenda, and having these certain types of questions be part of that conversation. So what makes you stay at this organization? What would make our organization better? Really asking questions that we're going to give people to be able to share those ideas and help you understand how you can better lead them. Also, I think a big part of engagement is certainly communication from leaders, and this is something that is always usually scored lowest on every engagement survey that I ever see. And one of the reasons I think is because it's sometimes not easy to do, because one, you have to usually have a plan. We don't have resources to have a communication person that can develop our communication necessarily for us. But it is such a critical piece of making sure that employees are hearing about what's going on in the organization. So we have kind of a concept called 7 times 7 ways, which is we try to communicate on different topics in different manners at different times, because there's a lot of information. It's easy to get lost. And so one of the things that I put together kind of as a tool for today was this doesn't have to be something that takes a lot of time, but really putting together your communication plan. Who's going to communicate, what are they going to communicate, and when. And you identify this, and then you stick to it as far as your communication plan. This really can give some organization to how you're going to communicate with your employees and who's going to do it. And it's something that if the more that you can share your vision, not only just your vision, but also different things that are going on in the organization can be really helpful. So anyway, I put a tool up there just to kind of share an example of that. It can be put together, get a round table together, can be put together pretty easily to know and define what your communication plan is. So with that, that's the last HR challenge that I was going to talk about today. Are there,
We have time for one question,
Okay.
actually. If anybody in the classroom wants to ask one question, we've got time for one. You've all nailed it. You all got your HR down. Yeah, hold on.
Might send out that one-on-one sheet. The one-on-one sheet that you talk about with employees and managers is really excellent. Maybe you could perhaps share that so that it could be shared with the rest of the group, because it really does help. And and the chart also would be really good.
I can do that.
If you're okay with it, I'll send out the presentation. A lot of people usually ask for it.
Okay, yeah, that's
So I'll
great.
send that out, and if you want to send me the one-on-one that you that I'll send
Okay.
that out too.
Perfect.
All right, well,
Okay,
let's give
thank you.
Anne a round of applause. Thank you so much. That was such great information. A couple things I want to mention really quickly for you guys in class. If you could complete the surveys on the table, and definitely let us know if there's other topics you would like us to talk on. It's extremely helpful. For those of you online, you'll be getting the survey via SurveyMonkey once I follow up. Just a reminder, we are actually not going to have a top 5 next month. I have a personal conflict, and we have a couple things happening in the office all at the same time. So we will take a month off next month, but we will be back in August, and we'll be talking about 5 steps for more effective self-promotion. So it's easy for a lot of us to sell our best friends. It's usually hard for us to sell ourselves in our own company. So we'll be giving you some tips on that. And the summit is November 8th. The registration is open. The speakers will be live on our website by July 8th, so you can see who all is going to speak at that, and we're really excited to announce that. We had an overwhelming response to the RFP this year, and we have great sponsors. Thanks to Oasis for sponsoring that too. So that will all be coming up. So thanks again for joining us today, especially you guys online, and we will see you soon. Thanks so much.